Hello my friends, I want to welcome you to our channel, which will help you fall asleep easily and with benefit. Share with us where you're watching from right now and what time it is for you. And while you're writing, I'll begin. Page: A history of the Israeli land. The history of the land of Israel represents an arena of clashes between faith, strength, and the striving for preservation. Once a territory of prophecies and promises, it turned into an object of empire ambitions, a cradle of faiths, and a source of unending confrontation. Its inhabitants were enslaved by the Egyptians, temples destroyed by the Babylonians, and the Romans tried to erase its distinct identity. However, no power managed to finally subjugate it. Rebellions weakened empires, exile strengthened the spirit, and many generations fought to reclaim what was lost. Yet each victory spawned new opponents, and each rebirthed new trials. So what happened next on this land? To understand the causes of wars, the strength of faith, and the unyielding spirit of its inhabitants, one must turn to the very origins. This story begins on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, in the Levant region, more precisely in Canaan. Located between the sea and the Jordan River, Canaan left a significant mark on world heritage. Situated at the crossroads of civilizations, the sea connected it with Europe to the west. To the south lay the Arabian Peninsula. To the east was Mesopotamia, and to the north paths to the ancient cultures of Anatolia and the Caucasus. This crossroad position opened many directions. The Phoenicians, skilled traders, gifted the world phonetic writing, the alphabet still in use today. In the late Paleolithic and early Neolithic, life thrived in these parts. Thanks to fertile valleys, highlands, and sea access, prehistoric people naturally settled in Canaan, one of the main centers and oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. Was Jericho in the Jordan Valley? Archaeological finds show its inhabitants had defensive walls and towers. Existing for about 11 millennia, Jericho remains one of the oldest inhabited cities. Throughout these eras, various tribes lived here. However, the appearance of the Canaanites in the 3rd millennium BCE changed the situation. These Semitic peoples quickly founded city-states, and trade flourished. Their states, including Jericho and Megiddo, interacted with Mesopotamia and Egypt. At the crossroads of cultures, they adopted some foreign customs but also spread their own. The ancient Canaanites, like their Egyptian neighbors, worshiped many deities. But on this land, destined to become holy, changes soon occurred. The history of the first monotheistic religion began. These narratives lie at the boundary of ancient history and mythology, further shrouding the origins of Judaism and mystery. It all started with Abraham, born in Ur of the Chaldees in Mesopotamia. According to tradition, he received instruction from God to go to Canaan and carry the divine word. Abraham left the security of his father's house, and he was promised that the land of Canaan would become the possession of him and his descendants, along with God's blessing. His journey was full of difficulties, harsh weather, and long travels through unfriendly lands. Stories about his adventures are contradictory. Some claim he visited Egypt. Later, Jacob had 12 sons, who became the forefathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob also introduced the name Israel, but circumstances, such as a 7-year famine and the discovery of his son Joseph, forced him to relocate to Egypt, where he was received by Pharaoh himself. With Jacob, the era of the patriarchs ended, and the people of Israel entered a new period in Egypt. The one who began this era in Egypt was Joseph. Sold into slavery by his brothers, Joseph managed to free himself and earn the Pharaoh's respect, who entrusted him with interpreting his dreams. The story of Moses begins in a period of severe oppression. Later, he fled from Egypt to Midian, and the fate of the Israeli people changed. One day, a burning bush attracted his attention, and from this bush, God called out to him, appointing Moses as the deliverer of the Israelites from Egyptian oppression. Moses appeared before the new Pharaoh with God's demand, "Let my people go." After refusal, Moses unleashed a series of plagues upon Egypt. The last one, which forced Pharaoh to yield, was the death of Egyptian firstborns. including Pharaoh's son. Pharaoh soon changed his mind and sent an army to destroy the Israelites. But Moses, with his staff, parted the waters of the Red Sea, saving his people. The sea then swallowed the Egyptian army. In this exodus, Moses became not only a leader, but also a prophet, receiving the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. Despite difficulties and trials, Moses led his people through the desert for decades. When they approached the Promised Land, his journey ended. He was not allowed to enter Canaan, and he ascended Mount Nebo, from where he saw the land from afar. There he died, leaving the legacy of one of the greatest leaders in history. After the death of Moses, the Israelites under the leadership of Joshua entered the Promised Land. Since Canaanites already lived there, settlement turned into conquest. Jericho was one of the first cities to fall before them. However, their unity soon broke down, and the era of judges began. These leaders, who were both warriors and prophets, appeared in times of crisis. They brought temporary calm, but the cycle of loyalty, sin, oppression, and deliverance marked this period for generations. Everything changed in the 11th century BCE when a dynasty rose from the chaos, uniting the tribes and inscribing their names into the national consciousness of Israel. To examine in detail the period of the United Kingdom of Israel, we turn again to the Old Testament. Although it's not entirely reliable due to the absence of other sources, we are forced to rely on it. It is believed that the Kingdom of Israel formed at the end of the 11th century BCE. At that time, the 12 disjointed tribes of Israel finally united under the rule of Saul. There were several reasons for this, the main one being protection from external threats, primarily the Philistines. The Philistines were a powerful people with a formidable fleet, and often raided southern coastal areas. Now, the first real state could withstand their attacks, and Saul was at the helm. Saul, from the tribe of Benjamin, like Moses, reluctantly accepted the unification of the tribes and the royal title, having been anointed by the prophet Samuel. The exact date is unknown, but some historians point to 1020 BCE. Saul proved himself in battles against the Ammonites and Philistines. However, the problem was that in his rule, Saul did not follow God's plan, and God rejected him as king. Saul became disobedient, and retribution was not long in coming. Around 1000 BCE, Saul lost a battle, his army, and his life in the battle on Mount Gilboa against the Philistines. Intentionally falling on his sword, realizing imminent defeat, 3 of Saul's sons also perished in the battle, and after 2 years of turmoil, David, his son-in-law, became the new king. David came from a simple family, although when God rejected Saul, the prophet Samuel chose David. His life did not change immediately. The youngest son in the family and a humble shepherd, David had little chance of a significant life until he met Goliath. Goliath was a Philistine warrior of enormous size. Although the height of 9 cubits is likely exaggerated, Goliath was a giant and the main strength of the Philistine army. No one dared to challenge him. David arrived at the battlefield only to bring food to his brothers. There he heard Goliath blaspheming God, and then David stopped seeing Goliath's size. He was confident that God was on his side and refused any weapon except a sling and 5 stones. Approaching Goliath, David mocked him and launched a stone from the sling. One precise hit to the forehead defeated Goliath, whom David beheaded with his own sword. Israel won, and David became highly respected and the king's son-in-law. Soon they became enemies. Although unaware of David's destined fate, Saul feared his influence and potential power and desired his death. Saul's attempts to kill him forced David to flee, beginning years of life as an exile. After Saul's untimely death, David was initially accepted as king only by his own tribe of Judah and ruled from Hebron for 7 years. Over time, David managed to consolidate power and become king of all Israel, supported by all tribes. It was he who founded the new capital around 993 BCE. This new capital, Jerusalem, became one of the most important, if not the most important city of all time. living according to God's will. David's reign was prosperous and is still remembered as Israel's golden age. The state was centralized, and old enemies, such as the Philistines and Moabites, ceded part of their lands to Israel. However, there were also problems, especially in his personal life. David's affair with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband caused a scandal, and even led to some rebellions. Because of the bloodshed, God did not allow David to build a monumental temple in Jerusalem. This task passed to his son by Bathsheba, Solomon, who inherited his father around 970 BCE. Unlike his father, Solomon's reign was marked by peace and large-scale construction. The state of Israel actively developed. After David's death, his son Solomon inherited the throne, and the first temple in Jerusalem was finally completed around 957 BCE, built on Mount Moriah. The temple became the spiritual heart of Israel. Almost immediately after completion, it became home to the Ark of the Covenant. The temple's luxury clearly demonstrated the wealth of Solomon and Israel. However, by the end of his reign, Solomon ceased to be universally beloved. High taxes to fund his projects turned the people against Solomon, and forced labor on these constructions bred hatred for the king. He stopped being one of them. He became aloof. Moreover, many foreigners migrated to Israel, and Solomon proclaimed religious tolerance, which also displeased the Israelites. The already discontented kingdom completely split after Solomon's death, because his son Rehoboam refused to lower taxes and abolish forced labor. Although there were no more large-scale projects, this caused an open rebellion, and the 10 northern tribes formed the Kingdom of Israel with Jeroboam at the head, while Rehoboam retained control over Judah in the south. These two kingdoms of one people became rivals, though both were much weaker than the once united nation. Soon, both kingdoms became prey to the powerful empires surrounding them. In 722 BCE, the Kingdom of Israel fell to the onslaught of the Assyrian Empire after a 3-year siege. People were forcibly deported and scattered throughout the empire. Today they are known as the Lost Tribes of Israel, and their fate remains unclear. The southern kingdom outlived the Assyrian Empire, but in 586 BCE, the Babylonian Empire conquered Jerusalem. The Babylonians burned the city, destroyed the first temple, and exiled many nobles to Babylon. This loss of independence and new period of exile became a severe test for the Israeli people and their faith. Yet the Jewish community in exile held onto its faith and continued to observe traditions. Even without the temple, even new prophets appeared, such as Ezekiel and Jeremiah. Returning to the homeland was a dream that came true in 539 BCE after almost 50 years of exile. The one who saved them was another conqueror. This time, it was the Persian ruler who conquered Babylon. They returned home, but their world had changed forever, and the Israeli people had to come to terms with it. For the Jewish people, the Persian conquest of Babylon was effectively liberation. The moment when the Persian king Cyrus the Great entered Babylon meant peace for all peoples forcibly relocated there, including the Jews. Interestingly, even the Babylonian elite had no major objections to foreign rule. For the Israelites, it was a return to the old ways of faith. The words of the prophets Ezekiel and Jeremiah turned out to be true. They promised that the suffering would end and return to Zion was near. Cyrus the Great proclaimed tolerance and allowed the returning exiled Jews to rebuild their temple anew. Among those who returned was Zerubbabel, a descendant of David, who took on the leadership of the grand task of temple restoration. Imagine the picture. Caravans winding through deserts and valleys, carrying not only supplies but also the hopes and prayers of a scattered people. Overcoming difficulties was not easy, similar to those the Jewish people faced upon first arrival. Hostility from neighboring peoples, lack of resources, and internal doubts. But the vision of a restored Zion was above all else. Construction of the Second Temple began in 516 BCE. This new temple, though less luxurious than Solomon's, symbolized a new beginning and the resilience of the people of Israel. The prophet Haggai passionately addressed the people, urging them to complete the work despite the difficulties. Is it time for you yourselves to live in your paneled houses, while this house lies in ruins? The return to Zion was not only physical but deeply spiritual and cultural. During this period, the foundations of Judaism in its modern form began to take shape. The Pentateuch, or Torah, was compiled and canonized, finally giving written form to the oral traditions that had sustained the Jewish people in exile. In this era, besides the temple under construction, believers began to build synagogues as centers of worship and learning. The development of synagogues later proved extremely important for the survival of Judaism. In subsequent centuries, one figure standing out in this transformative period is Ezra the scribe, a scholar and priest. Ezra led the second wave of returning exiles decades after the temple's restoration. His mission was clear: to restore the laws of Moses as the foundation of Jewish life. One of Ezra's first actions upon arriving in Jerusalem was to gather the people in the square and read the Torah. These words from the sacred text reminded the people of who they were, renewing their identity. From that moment, the Torah ceased to be a distant relic and became a living guide for the community. Thus, in uncertain times for the temple, Judaism began to rely more on sacred texts than on a single sacred place. And Ezra still influences the Jewish community because he founded the Great Assembly, where 120 leaders gathered to codify all Jewish customs. Under Ezra's leadership, the Great Assembly formalized prayers and blessings and added public Torah readings, which helped the teaching reach the community. Ezra's devotion to the Torah was above all else, for Ezra set his heart to study the law of the Lord and to practice it, and to teach statutes and ordinances in Israel. The scriptures note that Ezra's efforts reawakened Jewish religious identity. With public Torah reading, Ezra led all people onto a single righteous path, earning him the nickname Father of Judaism. His reforms were not without controversy. Marriages with the non-Jewish population had become common, and Ezra's insistence on strict Torah observance created tension within the community. That period of Persian rule was full of respect for local customs and religions, allowing relatively harmonious coexistence of cultures. Jews as loyal subjects flourished under Persian patronage, preserving their distinctiveness. They also had a degree of autonomy under the governance of high priests and local leaders. But this time did not last forever. The return to Zion and religious tolerance were not the end of the story. Something was changing, and soon their world would be engulfed by an unknown force. The fragile peace of the Persian era would give way to a storm of wars and conquests, setting the stage for a new chapter in the survival of the Jewish people. In 336 BCE, a new threat emerged from the west. Greece finally united under Macedonian rule, and a new young king wanted to settle scores with Persia over 100 years. After Persia attacked the Greek world, his name was Alexander, and this name would remain in history forever. Besides conquering Persia, Alexander the Great influenced Israel in many ways. Firstly, these people once again received new foreign rulers. But this one also wanted to change the culture of the many peoples he ruled and blend them into one nation. Born in Macedonia, Alexander was educated by Aristotle and raised in Greek traditions. From a young age, he believed in his great destiny. Alexander was a military genius and very ambitious in seeking glory. Nevertheless, he was surprised that what began as a Greek campaign for revenge against Persian invasions soon became something monumental, changing the course of history in this part of the world. From Greece, Alexander led his armies through Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt before striking deep into Persia and eventually reaching the Indus Valley. And among all these places was Israel. Thus began the Hellenistic period, when Greek language, art, and philosophy influenced societies from Egypt to India. This influence also reached Judea, but met significant resistance. While some Jews embraced this blend of Greek and Eastern cultures, others fiercely defended their traditions, openly opposing the Macedonian rulers. The culmination of this tension occurred almost 2 centuries after Alexander, when his empire had already been divided among his generals. The Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes decided to fully unify his kingdom through Hellenization. Though his predecessors had tolerated the Jewish faith, Antiochus banned Jewish religious practices and even desecrated the temple in Jerusalem, setting up an altar dedicated to Zeus there. Within days, all of Judea revolted. The rebellion began in the city of Modian, where authorities demanded that a Jewish priest, Mattathias, offer a sacrifice to a pagan god. Mattathias refused and killed both the officer and a Jewish collaborator. Soon he led a guerrilla resistance. After Mattathias' death in 166 BCE, in the second year of the rebellion, leadership passed to his son Judah Maccabee, also known as Judah the Hammer for his ferocity in battle. This Maccabean revolt took its name from this leader. Judah Maccabee was a skilled military commander who masterfully used guerrilla tactics against stronger Seleucid forces. Rebel forces grew each day, becoming strong enough to attack fortified cities and even liberate Jerusalem after the Battle of Beth Zur. This well-organized ambush in 164 BCE allowed the Maccabees to free their capital and restore the temple for its original purpose. This victory is commemorated by the holiday of Hanukkah, still celebrated in the Jewish community. Unfortunately, the rebellion was also partly a civil war between anti-Greek and pro-Greek Jews. Although Judah Maccabee perished in 160 BCE, the rebellion did not end with his death, as his brothers took over leadership. Ultimately, this rebellion secured a fragile autonomy, followed by occasional skirmishes between the Maccabees and Seleucids. During this period, Simon Fassi, one of the brothers, was recognized as both high priest and ruler of Judea. He founded the Hasmonean dynasty. But a new power also got involved in this Jewish struggle. The Roman Republic used diplomatic means to help Judea against the Seleucids, and thus gained influence in the semi-independent state. Nevertheless, this was a rare period of self-rule for the Jewish people. But, as always happened before, internal disagreements sowed the seeds of downfall, and Rome also helped. For decades, Rome expanded eastward, eventually conquering the Seleucid Empire. In the 70s BCE, two brothers from the Hasmonean dynasty, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus, claimed the throne, and both factions appealed to Pompey for support, practically inviting Rome to establish influence. Pompey saw an opportunity to bring Judea under Roman control. Initially attempting diplomacy, he met resistance when Aristobulus fortified Jerusalem. Pompey moved on the city, leading to a brutal siege. After 3 months, the city walls fell, and a bloody massacre followed. From that moment, Judea became a client kingdom, ruled by Roman-controlled figures such as Herod the Great. His reign showed that the light shines brightest before the end. Grand projects, such as the expansion of the Second Temple, the fortress of Masada, and the port city of Caesarea Maritima, serve as proof. However, his high taxes and loyalty to Rome made him hated among his subjects. After Herod's death in 04 BCE, the kingdom was divided among his sons, who could not control the state, and Rome annexed Judea in 06 CE. Roman rule in Judea was fraught with tension as the Jewish people resisted another foreign dominion. Although some rulers, such as Pontius Pilate, sometimes cooperated with Jewish leaders. All this led to open rebellion in the following decades. In 66 CE, due to high taxes, the First Jewish-Roman War began. At first, Jewish rebels surprised the Romans and achieved significant successes. Under the leadership of groups like the Zealots and Sicarii, they even liberated Jerusalem. For 4 years, they challenged the might of Rome, but their final defeat brought unprecedented punishment. The Romans won the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, starving the city and breaking through the walls of its severely weakened defenders. The punishment was the destruction of the Second Temple, the most devastating event any Jew had to see and endure. The only part that still remains is the Western Wall, today known as the Wailing Wall, probably the most sacred site for any Jew. Before the destruction, the temple was looted and its treasures were taken to Rome. The Arch of Titus, who led the Roman army and later became emperor, clearly depicts these events. Jews were scattered throughout the empire. However, they rebelled again for decades later during the Kitos War. But the Roman response was even harsher, and Emperor Trajan quickly suppressed the uprising. Nevertheless, the Jewish people did not stop resisting. In 132, under the leadership of Simon Bar Kokhba, they began another desperate uprising against Rome. Initially successful, Bar Kokhba's forces even retook Jerusalem. However, the Romans methodically destroyed fortress after fortress. The last one standing was Betar, where Bar Kokhba met his end in a brutal massacre. After this uprising, Rome erased the name Judea, renaming it Syria Palestina and prohibiting Jews from entering Jerusalem. The Jewish population was forcibly dispersed throughout the Roman Empire. From that moment, Jewish history continued outside Israel, forming the heritage of the diaspora. Eventually, Rome fell, and new peoples arose from its ruins. Neighboring Judea, a new religion and a new strong nation decided to leave their mark. What happened next was not just a continuation of history, but the beginning of a transformative new chapter for humanity. In the following centuries, Jerusalem stood as another proud Roman city, Aelia Capitolina, with pagan temples standing where the Jewish temple once stood. For the remaining Jews in Palestine, life became a quiet struggle to preserve their traditions among the ruins of a destroyed society. Soon they became a minority. Jewish villages still existed in Galilee and other rural, hard-to-reach areas, where small communities tried to rebuild life centered on agriculture and local trade. They gathered in small synagogues, clinging to their faith and shared history. As the centuries passed, Rome gave way to the Christian Byzantine Empire, and Jerusalem also became a holy city for Christians. This new religion, the state religion, presented a new challenge for Jews, and some new restrictions were introduced for them. They were prohibited from working in administration, and the construction of synagogues was strictly limited. In Jerusalem, Christian leaders intensified the ban on Jewish entry, turning the city into a symbol of exclusion, blaming Jews for the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. By the 6th century, emperors, especially Justinian I, added harsher measures, including interference in Jewish religious practices. This forced many to leave their homeland. In exile, Jewish life developed in amazing ways. Again, they found peace under Persian rule, especially in Babylon, where they had religious freedom. There, rabbis compiled the Babylonian Talmud, further codifying religious practices. Elsewhere in the Mediterranean world, Jewish communities adapted to their circumstances. In Egypt, North Africa, and parts of Europe, Jews worked as merchants, artisans, and scholars, contributing to the economies of the cities they lived in. But their safety was never guaranteed. The advent of Islam and the Muslim conquest of Judea in the 7th century changed the landscape of Jewish life in the Levant and beyond. As Muslim armies passed through Palestine, they ended Byzantine rule and began a new era. Again, a change of foreign masters affected the remaining Jews in Palestine and improved their situation. Under the Rashidun and Umayyad caliphs, Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem. Although they paid a special tax, they were protected as people of the book, which was much better than under the Byzantine Empire. In cities like Tiberias and Saif, Jewish communities began to revive. Galilee became a center of Jewish mysticism and study, where scholars interpreted ancient texts and preserved traditions. Nevertheless, this period of relative calm was not without problems. Whenever issues arose under the Abbasid Caliphate, economic difficulties, increased taxes, and periodic persecutions disrupted the fragile balance between Muslim rulers and their Jewish subjects. The diaspora, on the other hand, experienced much harsher anti-Semitism, but in some places unprecedented freedom. In Spain, under Muslim rule, Jewish communities experienced a golden age of cultural flourishing. Jewish poets, philosophers, and scientists became an integral part of the intellectual life of Al-Andalus. In Christian Europe, anti-Semitism prevailed. As medieval Christianity consolidated its power, Jews found themselves increasingly marginalized. Restrictions in professions, accusations of heresy, and outbreaks of violence were common. Blood libels, false accusations that Jews used the blood of Christian children in rituals, spread fear and hatred, paving the way for centuries of persecution. And these persecutions intensified to the maximum at the end of the 11th century. A series of wars, which no one expected, shook the Holy Land. And although Jews did not participate directly, they were very important elements in the historical puzzle. Western Europe emerged from the Dark Ages stronger and more devout, which strongly affected the Jewish people, and not in a good way. The Pope became the main political force in Europe. Under the false pretext of helping the Byzantines, Pope Urban II decided to show his power. His target was Jerusalem, now a holy city for all three major religions under the control of the Fatimid Muslims. The crusade promised the liberation of the Holy Land, but only for Christians. And people responded. Christian fanatics even marched on foot, although they were not soldiers. When this so-called People's Crusade passed through the Rhineland, these crowds turned against Jews, who were slaughtered. Some Jews chose martyrdom over forced conversion. This was just a sinister prelude to what followed. When the Crusaders finally captured Jerusalem in 1099, they began indiscriminate slaughter. Tens of thousands of Muslims and Jews were killed. In one of the city's synagogues, Jews seeking refuge were burned alive by the invaders. Jerusalem, once a hope for restoration, became a city of death for its Jewish inhabitants. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was established alongside other Crusader states. Under Crusader rule, Jerusalem was transformed into the heart of the Latin Kingdom, ruled by feudal lords and defended by military orders like the Templars. It was a true enclave of Western Europe in the East. While Christians celebrated their dominance, the Jewish and Muslim populations of the city faced oppression. Jews were once again expelled from the city and deprived of religious freedoms, while Muslims endured high taxes and desecration of sacred sites like the Dome of the Rock. The absence of any resistance from Jews showed the desperate situation they were in. But nothing lasts forever. By the mid-12th century, Muslim unity began to crystallize under strong leaders who sought to reclaim the Holy Land. Among them, Nur ad-Din Zanji played a crucial role in consolidating power in Syria and northern Iraq. His successor, Salah ad-Din Saladin, significantly expanded this legacy. An intellectual who could have been a scholar if he wished. A charismatic and devout leader, Saladin became the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, uniting much of the Islamic world under his banner. He was the best that could have happened to the Muslim world during the Crusades. Righteous and a military genius, Saladin gave paramount importance to the religious and strategic significance of Jerusalem as a political goal and a sacred duty. The Crusader states, meanwhile, suffered from deep internal problems and external threats. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was weakened by a succession crisis and lack of strong leadership. King Baldwin I suffered from leprosy, which limited his ability to lead. After his death in 1185, rivalry for the succession began. This disunity made the kingdom increasingly vulnerable to Saladin's growing power. After a dominant victory at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, Saladin began a campaign against the Crusader states. During the battle, the Crusaders were surrounded, exhausted, and without access to water. Most of the Crusader army was either killed or captured. Saladin followed this victory with a series of attacks, capturing Jerusalem in October of the same year. He was much more merciful, allowing Christians to leave the city unharmed after paying a ransom. This led to the Third Crusade under the leadership of King Richard the Lionheart of England. After arriving in Acre, Richard wanted to conquer Jerusalem, but eventually decided to secure Jaffa, where after several battles, he signed the Treaty of Jaffa. There, they decided that Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands, while Christians would have open access to their churches unarmed. Jews were not mentioned in this arrangement, but something was changing, something that would ignite a new era of exploration, trade, and conquests. The world was on the verge of being captured by an unknown force, and the age of empires was just beginning. After the Crusades, the Holy Land was exhausted, as it had been a battlefield for many decades with ensuing massacres and pogroms. Many villages virtually disappeared from the face of the earth. Nevertheless, Jerusalem remained the spiritual heart of the three great religions, and no one wanted to give up. Christians still had their small and weakened crusader states, while Muslims were on the rise. Jews, on the other hand, had only a dream that their city would be in their possession again, a dream that had lasted for over 1,000 years by then. The crusader states continued to weaken, losing territories to Muslim rulers. By 1291, the last stronghold, Acre, fell, marking the end of crusader rule in the Holy Land. And how they were expelled. Once enslaved soldiers from the Caucasian region, who were probably Turks, rose up and became leading figures in many Muslim states, especially the Ayyubid Sultanate in Egypt. They were known as the Mamluks, and they managed to overthrow the Ayyubid dynasty in 1250, creating the Mamluk Sultanate. They were a strong military state that even managed to fight the Mongols. After consolidating their power in Egypt, the Mamluks turned their attention to the remaining crusader states, and in 1291 finally destroyed the last political legacy of these wars. This victory was more than just a military triumph. It represented Islamic dominance in a region that had been a battlefield between Christian and Muslim forces for 2 centuries. But 3 decades before expelling the Crusaders, the Mamluks took control of Jerusalem when they entered the city. After victory at the Battle of Ain Jalut, the period between 1230 and 1260 was particularly unstable, and Jerusalem experienced several sieges and even brief Christian rule. The Mamluk triumph brought an era of stability, as the Mamluks ruled their possessions with a firm hand, constantly fearing rebellion. However, this era had many bright sides for Jerusalem and its population. It was during Mamluk rule that an important defensive project to strengthen the walls of Jerusalem was carried out. Moreover, Islamic rule in these centuries can be considered much more prosperous than European, with the Mamluks encouraging trade, learning, and architectural development. But there were also some drawbacks. The Mamluk encouragement of trade did not include Jerusalem, and it became only a religious center, where people of other religions had to pay special high taxes, different from Muslims. Moreover, persecutions in 1267 and forced conversions in the 14th century did not help the Jewish community. In the city, the region remained restless with tension between Muslims, Christians, and Jews, although the Mamluks tried to establish a time of peace. By then they had imposed strict Muslim rule, but as their nation began to weaken, a new Muslim nation wanted their territory, including Jerusalem. The Ottoman Empire, firmly controlling the Balkans and much of the Hungarian plain, was still not considered the leading Muslim power, and Sultan Selim I decided to change that. Also known as Selim the Grim, he was very ambitious and ruthless. The most important during his reign was his authority, imposed by harsh measures if necessary. Another important feature was Selim's deep devotion to religion, and he saw himself as the protector of Sunni Islam. Moreover, he was a brilliant military commander, insulted by some actions of the Mamluks. His response was quick. Selim lured the Mamluks onto the battlefield at Marj Dabik and in one decisive battle, essentially ended the existence of their nation. In 1516, the Ottomans took control of Palestine, including Jerusalem. The fall of the Mamluks and the Ottoman takeover changed everything in this region. The Ottomans brought with them new administrative structures, architectural projects, and a change in governance that would have a long-term impact on the region. One thing, however, did not change. The Holy City was still under Islamic rule. Unlike the Mamluks, the Ottomans tried to respect the religious significance of Jerusalem for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, at least initially. This allowed the city to retain its status as a pilgrimage center for all three Abrahamic religions. Under Ottoman rule, the region experienced a period of real stability because for the first time since the Roman Empire, Jerusalem was in the hands of one of, if not the most, powerful nations in the world. Jews still had to pay a protection tax, but they were allowed to freely practice their faith, and the Jewish community flourished, especially after the expulsion of Jews from Spain and Portugal. These people, leaving Europe, mostly settled in Salonika or returned home to Jerusalem. The Ottomans focused on developing infrastructure and built roads, bridges, and markets. Sultan Suleiman repaired the walls again. Nevertheless, there were periods of hardship for Jews from time to time, and the city itself faced economic decline starting from the early 17th century. But other Jewish centers advanced, at least religiously. Cities like Safed or Tiberias also had strong religious leaders and groups, especially in Safed, where Kabbalah, the mystical interpretation of the Torah, began to take root. As the centuries progressed, the Ottoman Empire began to lose the technological race to European powers. This also led to their military defeats. Once a mighty empire, it became a battlefield for European powers seeking to establish influence and take as much wealth as possible from the Ottomans. Moreover, these European powers became very interested in the Holy Land. Great Britain, France, and Russia began to vie for influence in Palestine, using religious and political alliances to promote their interests. This foreign interest directly impacted the Jewish population of the region, as it led to increased Jewish immigration. Although many Jews had already returned from all over Europe in previous centuries. As the Ottoman Empire weakened, Jews from Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire began to flock to Palestine, seeking to build a new life on land they considered their home. The weakening of Ottoman control over Palestine worried the local population, especially Jews and Arabs, who began to strive for greater autonomy. But what would happen next would forever change the Jewish world. Only Jews themselves could fight for their cause, and the spark came from the most unexpected place. After so much destruction and devastation in Judea, especially under Roman rule, Jewish communities were scattered around the world in the so-called Jewish diaspora. For centuries, they lived as minorities in foreign lands, sometimes tolerated, but often persecuted. By the 19th century, their longing for the homeland had not disappeared. It remained a quiet undercurrent in Jewish life, a memory passed down through generations. And then came a turning point. The 19th century was an era of nationalism. Throughout Europe, multi-ethnic empires ruled diverse populations, and many of these groups began to demand self-determination. Czechs, Poles, Hungarians, Serb stateless peoples began to rebel against imperial rule, asserting their right to form independent homelands. But they were not alone. Jews, though scattered and stateless, also felt the awakening of a national revival. In this era, people began to define themselves not only by religion or local identity, but also by language, shared history, and the dream of statehood. For Jews, however, everything was much more complicated. Living as a minority in every country, without territory they could call their own, they were often considered strangers, suspicious, alien, and sometimes dangerous. In many nationalist movements, anti-Semitism was not a random feature. It was a defining element. Anti-Semitism spread rapidly across Europe, and it was no longer confined to old religious prejudices. It took new racial and political forms. It wasn't just about social isolation or legal restrictions. It became violent. Pogroms, organized massacres, and riots swept across Eastern Europe, especially in the Russian Empire. Synagogues were burned, Jewish homes looted, communities destroyed. It was terror, and often it was state-sanctioned or ignored by the state. For Theodor Herzl, the answer became painfully clear. Jews needed their own homeland, a place where they could live without fear, restore their identity, and control their future. He envisioned a state, not just a refuge, but a revival. In 1897, he turned vision into action. He convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, uniting Jewish leaders and thinkers with one goal: the creation of a Jewish homeland. At the end of the Congress, Herzl wrote in his diary, "In Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If not in 5 years, then certainly in 50, everyone will see it." The proposed homeland was Palestine, or, as Jews often called it, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. At that time, Palestine was still under Ottoman rule. The once mighty Ottoman Empire was in decline, trying to hold on to its remote provinces. Palestine had become a backwater, rural, undeveloped, and forgotten. Cities like Jerusalem, Jaffa, and Haifa were small, scattered places, surrounded by villages inhabited by Muslims, Christians, and a small number of Jews. But for Zionist thinkers, Palestine was not just a piece of land. It was the historical and spiritual homeland of the Jewish people, where kings like David and Solomon once ruled, where prophets walked, and where the Jewish temple once stood. The vision of return, long cherished in Jewish prayers and texts, now began to take political form. In the 1880s, long before Herzl's Congress, the first Jewish migrants had already begun to arrive. Many came not as ideologues but as refugees. Pogroms swept through towns and villages. Jewish communities were devastated. Trauma forced many to leave. Some went to America, others to Western Europe, but a small group turned south, to Palestine. This wave became known as the First Aliyah, a Jewish word meaning descent, referring to immigration to the Holy Land. It began in 1882 and lasted until the early 20th century. About 30,000 Jews arrived in Palestine during this period, mainly from Eastern Europe and Yemen. Many were driven by ideology Zionist dreamers who believed they were rebuilding the Jewish homeland. Others simply fled the horrors of pogroms. The life in Palestine was not easy. The climate was harsh, the land unfamiliar, diseases widespread. Many of the settlers were urban Jews with no farming experience. They struggled to cultivate the land and face the local population. Tension arose not only with Muslims, who constituted the majority in Palestine, but sometimes with Christians and even existing Jewish communities, who were suspicious of the newcomers. To survive, the settlers needed help. This help came from wealthy Jewish philanthropists in Europe. Foremost among them was Baron Edmond de Rothschild, a French Jewish banker who believed in the Zionist cause. He funded agricultural settlements, built infrastructure, and sent European experts to guide the colonists. Rothschild's support was crucial. Without it, many early communities might not have survived. But his involvement also had its conditions. He exercised tight control over the settlements, limiting their independence. Some settlers resented this, feeling like hired laborers rather than pioneers. Nevertheless, despite difficulties, diseases, and local hostility, the First Aliyah laid the foundation for what was to come. New cities were founded, such as Rishon LeZion, Petah Tikva, and Zikron Yaakov. A new Jewish presence was forming, not only spiritual but physical. The Ottoman Empire, already suspicious of foreign influence, grew increasingly anxious about Zionist immigration, fearing unrest in a religiously sensitive area like Palestine. The Ottomans began imposing restrictions on Jewish land purchases and immigration, but their control, especially in remote provinces, was limited. In many areas, local Arab leaders and communities had more influence than the government in Istanbul, and they too began to see the Zionists not just as refugees, but as colonists with a political agenda. Tension grew. The dream of Zionism collided with the harsh reality of geopolitics. Early Zionists believed in peaceful settlement, diplomacy, and cooperation. Herzl envisioned negotiations with the Ottomans, European powers, and even local Arabs. But history would soon show how fragile that dream was. Competing nationalisms, Jewish and Arab, would begin to clash in the coming decades. And so, as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Zionism stood at a crossroads. It had transformed from a dream into an organized movement. It had taken root in the soil of Palestine, but the land was complex, populous, and contested. The path forward would be full of obstacles, rival empires, political resistance, and violent conflict. But for many Jews, there was no way back. The old world had closed its doors. The promise of equality in Europe had failed. Zionism became not just a hope, but a necessity. As Herzl once wrote, "If you will it, it is no dream." Now the task was to turn the dream into reality on land sacred to many, and closely watched by the world. World War I began in 1914 during Jewish migration to their ancestral home, still belonging to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire sided with Germany, and its territories became coveted by the Entente powers. Ottoman provinces were very diverse in ethnicity, languages, and faiths. Palestine, a fertile but strategically modest region, suddenly became a prize. The military reality changed life for all its inhabitants, including the Jewish community. Ottoman administration in Jerusalem under the harsh military governor Cemal Pasha pursued repressive policies. Jews, especially recent Zionist immigrants from Russia and Europe, found themselves in a terrible position. The Ottomans, suspicious of foreign loyalties, deported many Jews as enemy citizens, while others were conscripted into the Ottoman army under harsh conditions. The Jewish community, estimated at 85,000 in 1914, suffered from wartime shortages, diseases, and poverty, and the steady flow of funds from Jewish philanthropic organizations abroad dwindled. Due to wartime difficulties, Zionist organizations struggled to maintain agricultural colonies, many of which were on the verge of ruin. On the other hand, the major European powers were dividing the Ottoman Empire, including Palestine, among themselves. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 divided the region between Great Britain and France. This new circumstance had one important consequence: decades and decades of turmoil, because they did not care about the people inhabiting them. But there was another promise, public, which had even more consequences. In 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, a statement of support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This document, only 67 words long, carried the seeds of many changes and conflicts. Jews fleeing persecution in Europe saw Palestine as a refuge and a revival of biblical promises. However, this declaration completely ignored the Arab population, the overwhelming majority of Palestine's inhabitants. But why did the British do this? There were two reasons. The first, Palestine's proximity to the Suez Canal, a crucial route for British imperial trade and military operations. By supporting Zionist aspiration, Britain hoped to secure influence in the region after the war. And the second was of a personal nature. Some leaders of the Zionist movement, such as Chaim Weizmann, had established close relations with influential British politicians. Weizmann was a chemist with many connections in high society, and he used this to promote the Zionist cause. The British government saw an opportunity to influence the area economically, promoting humanitarian causes. Thus, with the declaration, Britain clearly chose a side in the escalating Arab-Jewish conflict. The British Declaration became the fulfillment of a long-awaited dream for all Zionists. The Jewish people living in Palestine received hope for a better tomorrow, under the protection of the world's largest empire. The moment of the long-awaited national home was near. From that moment, many Jews decided to move to Palestine, feeling the support they would have. But some other people also lived there, and they were not Jews, and they were far from happy. The Arab population in Palestine saw the Balfour Declaration as an attack on their homeland. They had lived there for generations and did not want to live in a Jewish state. They also began to question Britain's right to divide the lands of other peoples, especially without consulting anyone, such as Arab leaders. This declaration created a conflict that lasted over a century and is far from any resolution. Although in the times of empire collapses, It would have been very difficult to resolve this mixture of peoples in Palestine without conflicts. Obviously, the ever-present tension between Arab and Jewish communities soon turned into violence. Even Arthur Balfour himself later confirmed that the region of the Holy Land is very complex, and the declaration did not help in solving any problems. But from Britain's point of view, it was the best possible solution. In fact, Balfour and the British government cared only about their interests and influence in the region, and the Middle East in general. And another important thing, the Balfour Declaration was only a promise of hope, nothing more. But it shaped one of the most stubborn and bloody conflicts of the 20th century. As the Great War drew to a close, British troops under the command of General Edmund Allenby advanced into Palestine, expelling Ottoman armies. The fall of Jerusalem was particularly celebrated in Britain. On that day, Allenby proclaimed, "The Crusaders have returned." These words could not be further from the truth. As Britain was an empire that divided peoples with straight lines on a map, with the blessing of the League of Nations in 1920, Britain assumed the mandate for Palestine, tasked with preparing the territory for self-government, as well as using the resources of the land. This mandate had many problems because the British wanted to make a Jewish home possible, and also protect the rights of Arabs, who, by the way, were the majority. And on top of all that, Jewish migration continued and intensified. These new settlers drained swamps and built collective farms. One of their main achievements was founding a new urban center on the coast. Tel Aviv became a modern city from its inception, showing the European customs of these settlers. Arabs in Palestine could not allow the loss of their land, as they saw this migration as colonization taking their land and threatening their way of life. "We are not against Jews as people, but we reject their colonial ambitions on our land," said Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Riots began almost immediately in Jerusalem in 1920 and in Jaffa in 1921, leaving hundreds dead and wounded on both sides. The British could not handle the situation and tried to placate Arabs by declaring quotas on Jewish immigration to slow migration. This did not help but angered the Zionists. In the 1930s, it got even worse. The greatest evil in the history of our planet was rising in Germany, targeting Jews especially. Many sought refuge in Palestine, fleeing the Nazis, leading to the arrival of thousands more. Each arrival added to Arab fears of demographic and political displacement. Therefore, they revolted. The Arab Revolt of 1936 lasted until 1939 and was directed against Jews but also against the British. The two, allies and British forces, relied on Jewish militias to help them fight the Arabs. Atrocities against civilians became common from both sides. Finally, the Arabs could no longer fight, and the revolt was suppressed, but the British changed their policy by issuing the White Paper. The White Paper strictly limited Jewish migration and imposed restrictions on their land purchases. It also promised the Arabs their own state. The moment could not have been worse for Jews, as their world in Europe was collapsing, and they were trying to find a home. But this was only the beginning, and the worst episode in the history of the Jewish people was on the threshold. The year was 1933. A change of government occurred in Germany. A moment that so often happened in every European nation, but also a moment that shaped world history and led to the destruction of Jews. Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany and began to implement his ambitions. People without their homeland were persecuted. Hitler, a failed artist, spread his agenda of betrayal that led to losing the Great War, and of Jews as those who committed this betrayal. In his plans and in the Nazi program, he proclaimed racial purity and the Jewish threat, although many did not take him seriously. From that cold January morning in 1933, everything changed for Jews in Europe. From the first moment, Jews in Germany were increasingly marginalized by a series of anti-Semitic laws, restricting their rights. Many lost jobs, scholarships, and the right to participate in public life. The next step was the Nazis' introduction of their infamous Nuremberg laws in 1935, which excluded Jews from all aspects of public life, including citizenship, professions, and cultural participation. But besides his personal war against Jews, Hitler also worked to increase Germany's size. Soon, the situation Jews had to endure in Germany was reflected in countries occupied by the Nazis. In fact, in occupied territories, the Nazis were even more brutal, and a systematic approach was adopted. The spread of Nazi Germany is very well known, so there is no need to go into details. In this still relatively peaceful period in 1938 and 1939, they annexed Austria and most of Czechoslovakia. Of course, this period was not so peaceful, especially one night in 1938. It was a windy autumn day when a Polish Jew named Herschel Greenspan heard news about his parents. They had been expelled from Germany, stuck at the border, homeless and hopeless. His reaction was quick and thoughtless because he decided to kill a German diplomat in France, where Greenspan lived. The Nazis could not have wished for a better pretext to unleash brutal terror against Jews, the terrorist element in their country. The night between November 9th and 10th was lawless. That night across Germany and Austria, the SS and civilians staged a bloody orgy of death and destruction in Jewish quarters. Synagogues were burned, Jewish home businesses smashed and looted, and their glass storefronts shattered, looking like crystals, giving the pogrom its grim name Kristallnacht. Homes were broken into, families dragged into the streets, beaten and humiliated. The toll of the night was devastating. Over 1,400 synagogues were destroyed, plus numerous Jewish businesses and homes. Nearly 100 Jews were killed, and 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Besides all this, the Jewish community had to pay a large fine for the damage. And this was only the beginning of even more sinister plans in the following years. After 1939 and the start of World War II, Germany and its satellites controlled most of Europe, and Jews living in those places had to flee for their lives, mostly unsuccessfully. The Nazis were not just at war with other nations. They were at war with an entire people. And the man who was one of the main architects of Kristallnacht had new ideas, even darker than before. Reinhard Heydrich was a very intelligent man, whose mind could only be measured by his ambitions. Moreover, a lack of moral compass and human compassion helped shape this man as one of the most memorable Nazi leaders. Born in 1904, Heydrich was described as brilliant and arrogant. After a scandal destroyed his naval career in 1931, his only chance was the SS and Heinrich Himmler. There he progressed again at a staggering speed, and Hitler even gave him the nickname the man with the iron heart. Soon Heydrich became one of the architects of the Holocaust. His cold efficiency when he viewed people as numbers made him perfect for this new plan. Devised in 1941, after all, he truly believed in the Nazi vision of racial purity. With Heydrich's help, the Nazis began working on their final solution plan, which was systematic genocide. Systematic genocide intended to erase the Jewish name from the face of the earth. People were dehumanized, treated as numbers, killed on the spot, buried in mass graves, and sent in freight trains to places like Auschwitz and Treblinka. There, millions of Jews were killed in gas chambers, by starvation and brutal force. It was heartbreaking, and no one was spared, not even children. Brutal sadists made these last moments of poor people's lives even worse. And as the war progressed, it became clear that the Holocaust was not spontaneous but the culmination of years of escalation. And when they began to lose the war, the full scale of the Holocaust became tragically clear. Everyone was shocked. However, the question remains, was anti-Semitism present in other nations? That some of them turned a blind eye to the horrifying reports? Or did it all seem too incredible to them? 6 million Jews became victims of a mad culture, along with millions of other victims of various peoples. This is the most tragic history of the 20th century. With the destruction of so many Jewish communities, survivors were scattered across Europe. The question of what to do with Jewish refugees was often raised. Jews mainly wanted to go to a place they called home and create a Jewish state in Palestine. By the end of World War II, the British were under enormous pressure from both Jews and Arabs who wanted this territory for themselves. For Jews, the Holocaust clearly showed that they would never be protected without their own state. The Zionist movement also gained many followers after the war. Jewish survivors from concentration camps rushed to Palestine, and the British eventually decided to leave after creating big problems in Palestine. They messed everything up and let the international community decide. In 1947, the United Nations proposed partitioning Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. The Jewish community accepted the plan, but the Arab community rejected it. In 1948, when British rule officially ended, Jews had barely survived probably the worst genocide in the world, organized in just a few years. But their struggle was far from over, and they had to fight again. But even in the shadow of this darkest chapter, the Jewish people found a way to rise again. Their journey was not finished. It was only beginning. And in 1948, everything changed for the better. It was the spring of 1948, and the British left the Holy Land after 3 decades of colonial rule. Jews and Arabs were left alone to settle their differences without anyone between them. The main problem was that these differences were irreconcilable, although the Jewish side had agreed to partition a year earlier. And since there was no possibility of compromise, one side decided to take decisive measures. These decisive measures became monumental. The fulfillment of a 2,000-year dream of an independent Jewish state, all in the middle of a century that saw the worst that could happen to any nation. The State of Israel was born from the ashes of a century filled with persecution and wars. All centuries of wandering, suffering, and hopes led to this moment. And although it may look like an impulsive and decisive action taken, without care for any consequences, nothing could be further from the truth. The moment when the Israeli side went in the direction of full takeover of the disputed land was after the UN partition plan of 1947 failed. To explain further, the UN offered a solution that satisfied no one, but it was a compromise, partitioning Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab. And although these 2 states were to be fully independent, the city of Jerusalem itself awaited a different fate, specifically international administration. This proposal was adopted as a resolution by the United Nations General Assembly in November 1947. However, these 2 states would not be of equal size. The proposed Jewish state would stretch about 55%, while the Arab counterpart would occupy 45%. Although the plan aimed to balance the 2 sides, it had its flaws. The Jewish community fully allowed the Zionist movement to represent their side, and they mostly accepted this plan. Jews were tired of wars, conflicts, escalations, and massacres. They were still healing their wounds from the Holocaust, and were not ready to jump into another conflict immediately. Moreover, this was a decisive step towards creating a Jewish state recognized internationally. And after the already mentioned Chaim Weizmann, who still played a big role, and Theodor Herzl, there was another important figure who took the lead in creating an independent state. His name was David Ben-Gurion, leader of the Jewish Agency. Born as David Grun in 1886 in the Russian Empire, he grew up surrounded by ideas of Zionism, but also socialism. Since the state in the crumbling Russian Empire was bad even for Russians, let alone Jews. Ben-Gurion immigrated to Palestine when he was 20. There he worked physical labor and soon became a leader of the labor movement. Nevertheless, his dream was to lead the Zionist movement, and he worked tirelessly to achieve it. From 1920, when he had already established his name, Ben-Gurion devoted himself to only one goal: the Free State of Israel. In difficult years, he became the undisputed leader of Jews in Palestine, building infrastructure and preparing the area for independence. His selection as leader of the new state was obvious. But there was one problem. Arabs and their allies in neighboring states did not accept the partition. And since the British had already left, only one solution remained. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel. This proclamation, made from Tel Aviv, was both a triumph and a challenge. It marked the end of Jewish exile from their ancestral homeland. But although this exile reached an end, it was not a time for celebration. It was a time to defend the declaration, as it met fierce resistance. Surrounding Arab states began military intervention, with the sole aim of preventing the founding of Israel and erasing it from the map. What happened next ignited a conflict that would shape the region's future for decades. The War of Independence began. The new Israeli state, with unprepared military forces, had to face large armies of 5 much stronger armies simultaneously. Everything was lacking, especially military equipment. In the first few days of the war, this difference was quite noticeable, and the outnumbered Jewish forces struggled to defend the borders of their young state. But there was one thing driving the Israelis. Their forces fought to keep the dream alive. Determined to defend their homeland and their survival, they fought with everything they had, very effectively. And piece by piece, the situation changed and they gained the upper hand, gradually securing crucial territories. At this stage, front lines stretched from the northern border with Lebanon through central Palestine and down into the Negev desert in the south. Israeli forces, however, managed to recapture key cities such as Haifa, Jaffa, and Jerusalem. But victory was not complete. Jerusalem had to be divided into 2 parts, one under Israeli control and the other under Jordanian control. The year was 1949, and Israel defended its independence. Arabs got much less than the UN partition plan had proposed for them, but the Israeli side paid a high price for this victory. Still recovering from the Holocaust, this were added new scars to these tormented people. But Arabs also had to recover. They lost everything. It was also their homeland, and their options were to become a minority under foreign rule or leave. And some were forced to leave. Over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were displaced from their homes during the conflict, many becoming refugees in neighboring Arab countries. The crisis was far from over. This was only the first round. At that moment, the Israeli people finally had time to catch their breath again and heal their wounds. But what was next? And how long would it take for Arab nations to again form an alliance against Israel? And what if, as every time, Jews destroy their own nation from within in internal conflicts? The Palestinian area was still very restless and always on the brink of conflict, and international diplomacy would be closely involved in Middle Eastern politics. Despite everything and through intense military conflict, Israel not only survived the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, but also expanded its territory beyond what was granted by the United Nations. Despite this military success, the future remained uncertain. Israel was surrounded by hostile neighbors, all refusing to accept the legitimacy of a sovereign Jewish state. Territorial acquisitions Israel made during the war, though unplanned, created new complications. Ironically, some Palestinian Arabs who initially rejected the UN partition plan were now willing to accept it. But Israel changed its position. Having won on the battlefield, Israeli leaders saw little reason to accept anything less than the territory they had secured. Now, Israel faced enormous challenges. The state was permanent, but its survival depended on solving serious problems, closed borders, trade isolation, and constant threats. Nevertheless, one issue became a priority: absorbing the overwhelming influx of Jewish immigrants. After the Holocaust, Jews from all over Europe and the Middle East rushed to the new state, seeking security and a fresh start. These new citizens came from different cultures. Many did not speak Hebrew, and integration proved difficult. But they had no alternative. The Israeli government had to act decisively to unite the population. Although the process was painful, The ever-present external threats created a strong sense of solidarity among the people. In 1956, one of these threats escalated into war. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, a military officer who led the 1952 revolution that overthrew Egypt's monarchy, nationalized the Suez Canal. Nasser was a passionate Arab nationalist, a fierce opponent of Israel, and a staunch anti-imperialist. His move aimed to reclaim Egypt's resources and prestige, but it provoked Britain and France, who depended on the canal for trade. At the same time, Egypt blocked the Straits of Tiran, critically damaging Israel's economy. In response, Israel joined Britain and France in a secret plan to invade Egypt. Nasser also supported Palestinian Fedayeen operating against Israel. Israel launched Operation Kadesh, quickly advancing across the Sinai Peninsula. Initial military success was impressive. However, the international reaction was harsh. In one of the rare moments during the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union demanded an immediate cessation of hostilities. Under pressure, the three invading nations agreed to a ceasefire. Although the blockade was lifted, Nasser emerged as a symbol of Arab resistance. Israel won militarily, but paid a diplomatic price. Many began to view it as a militant state seeking expansion. As the 1960s began, Israel turned to secrecy and intelligence. One man embodied this new strategy: Eli Cohen, the legendary spy. Born in Egypt in the 1920s to a Jewish family, Cohen faced persecution and moved to Israel in 1957. There he was recruited by Mossad and sent undercover to Syria, assuming the identity of a wealthy Syrian businessman. Cohen skillfully infiltrated the country's military and political elite. Cohen gained access to top-secret information, even visiting military positions on the Golan Heights. In a clever act of espionage, he suggested planting trees for shade for Syrian troops, unintentionally marking military sites for Israeli intelligence. Over time, Cohen transmitted detailed maps and defense plans back to Israel. But in 1965, during a radio transmission, Syrian authorities tracked his signal. He was arrested, tortured, and publicly executed in Damascus, despite international appeals. To this day, Syria has refused to return his body. While Israel conducted covert operations, Arab hostility remained open. Border clashes between Israel and Syria intensified. Meanwhile, Nasser sought to reassert his leadership in the Arab world, again blocking the Straits of Tiran, cutting Israel off from the Red Sea, where seemed inevitable. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan massed troops on Israel's borders. On June 5, 1967, Israel launched a preemptive strike. The result was stunning. In just 6 days, Israel defeated the combined Arab forces, capturing vast territories: the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. On the Golan, Israeli forces had an advantage. Thanks to Cohen, they knew Syrian soldiers were positioned under trees. The 6-day war radically changed the regional balance. Israel's survival was no longer in question. Arab leaders now faced the difficult truth of a permanent Jewish state in their midst. Despite securing its existence, Israel was now burdened with new dilemmas. The Palestinian question remained unresolved, and Arab states thirsted for revenge. This opportunity presented itself 6 years later. In the meantime, Israel's newly expanded borders became points of tension, and the Arab world planned a coordinated strike. On October 6, 1973, on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in Judaism, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack. The goal was not to destroy Israel but to reclaim lost lands and restore pride. This time, Arab armies were better organized and equipped with Soviet weapons. Israel was caught off guard. In the first days, Arab forces made alarming progress, but with critical support from the United States, Israel recovered. After weeks of fierce fighting, Israeli troops crossed the Suez Canal, threatening Cairo, and simultaneously advanced toward Damascus. The situation changed. What began as a war to force Israel to negotiate now forced Arab states to seek international mediation. By the end of October, the war ended. Israel repelled the invasion, but its confidence was shaken. The illusion of invulnerability disappeared. Both sides suffered too much to continue the path of endless war. Diplomacy now became necessary. 5 years later, diplomacy prevailed. In 1978, mediated by U.S. President Jimmy Carter, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, and Israeli Prime Minister Menahem Begin signed the historic Camp David Accords. After 13 days of tense negotiations, Egypt became the first Arab nation to recognize Israel. In exchange, Israel withdrew troops from the Sinai Peninsula. It was a landmark moment. Peace, once unthinkable, was now within reach, though it required bitter compromises. Nevertheless, peace was fragile. Tensions persisted. Some Arab groups and countries continued to reject Israel's right to exist, and for them, there was no place for negotiations. With them, war took a more shocking and unpredictable form. When Israel declared independence, all Arabs living nearby opposed it, and it ended badly for them. And after the wars, Israel became even larger, and the Arab population in the country became even more numerous. They were still against any new Jewish migration to Israel but had no power to prevent it, and they were under foreign rule, treated as a minority, treated as an enemy. In 1948, Jewish paramilitary forces carried out a massacre in the village of Deir Yassin. Although the village was part of a non-aggression pact, although the official Israeli state was not involved, the death of 107 civilians spread fear through all Palestinian villages that were simply waiting to be next in line. Many families fled their homes, taking only the bare necessities, hoping for a quick return that never came. By the end of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, over 750,000 people had fled or were expelled. Jews were no longer a minority in their state. Over 400 villages were destroyed, and what remained of property was taken by Israeli forces. By law, those who left were forbidden to return. Refugees turned to friendly countries that hated Israel and further spread this hatred against those who forced them from their homes. The West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria were full of refugee camps that became permanent settlements for people with nowhere else to go. Conditions in them varied, but were nowhere good. The memory of this event, known as the Nakba catastrophe, still wounds all generations of Palestinians and still fuels tension. They want to return and erase this symbol of injustice. On the other hand, Israelis see these events as a struggle for the survival of a nation surrounded by enemies. But Palestinians did not want to leave the matter unanswered. In 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization PLO was formed. At first, it was under the guardianship of neighboring Arab governments and had more of a symbolic status, without any real influence. The moment when a new young and charismatic leader took over the PLO was in 1969, when all seemed lost. But he changed the course of the organization and the history of the region. His name was Yasser Arafat. He was salvation for Palestinians after the catastrophe of the Six-Day War, an Israeli occupation of almost all refugee camps in the West Bank and Gaza, among other territories. Although born in Cairo in 1929, Arafat's family had connections to Jerusalem, and he felt a pull to the homeland. Orphaned early, he did not have an easy early life. During the greatest conflicts in 1948, Arafat was a student in Cairo studying civil engineering, where he witnessed growing hatred towards Jews firsthand. That's when he became politically active, organizing protests and fighting for the Palestinian cause. He also turned to military tactics, and in 1959, he became one of the founders of Fatah, aiming to wage guerrilla warfare and liberate Palestine. Fatah was different. It was independent and did not rely on money from Arab nations. Therefore, it did not need to obey them. They wanted Palestinians to fight for Palestine. Arafat became very influential and instantly recognizable, always wearing a keffiyeh draped on his head. People either saw him as a symbol of Palestinian resistance and suffering, or as a dangerous terrorist unwilling to negotiate. He was not afraid to organize attacks on Israel, which drew international attention to the Palestinian cause. He gained both followers and enemies. Those closer to him describe him as warm and inspiring. He was the face of the movement, or at least the one they wanted to show the world. Their suffering drew the attention of the UN, especially after the Six-Day War, when more problems rose, especially in refugee camps now under Israeli control. There, the Israeli government began building new settlements for Jewish settlers. The UN issued Resolution 242, clearly siding with the Palestinians and calling on Israel to withdraw troops from recently occupied territories. The PLO did not give up and continued its guerrilla war from Jordan. But problems arose when the PLO began acting independently. Tension with Jordan intensified and eventually led to military incidents involving the Syrian army, while Israel remained a constant threat. After the events of Black September, which can be described as a Jordanian civil war, Arafat and his forces were forced to leave Jordan and move to Lebanon, now Israel's enemy number one. After the Camp David Accords, Palestinians felt betrayed and responded by continuing violent actions. Some called it terrorism, others liberation. This led to the 1982 Israel-Lebanon War. Israel devastated Lebanon's economy, and massacres occurred from all sides. This war also involved the PLO, which Israel blamed for the conflict. Meanwhile, Lebanese militias fought for power, and the Syrian army tried to intervene again. Ultimately, Israel demonstrated its military might and occupied southern Lebanon for 15 years, securing its borders but giving birth to a new enemy, Hezbollah. As the 1980s progressed, so did tensions. The political situation in the Holy Land was like a tightening knot. There seemed to be no solution that could satisfy more than one side, and none were ready to compromise. Then everything changed in 1987, on December 9th. A truck driven by a Jew collided with a car in the Jabalia refugee camp, killing 4 Palestinians. Only a few days earlier, an Israeli had been killed by a Palestinian. Many viewed this incident as revenge. Combined with poor living conditions and police treatment, this event became the final spark. Palestinians began an uprising, showing civil disobedience, painting graffiti, shouting slogans, blocking roads, and throwing Molotov cocktails at Israeli forces. Settlements and cities became targets. The First Intifada began. Although Israel had superior military technology, Palestinians showed remarkable resistance, sometimes throwing stones at tanks. The First Intifada was not as bloody as earlier clashes but brought constant fear from both sides. Israelis feared hidden bombs. Palestinians could not know if they would be viewed as civilians or combatants. Over 2,000 people lost their lives, but there were countless other victims. Teenagers and children were regularly beaten with clubs, and ultimately the UN had to intervene. The Madrid Conference in 1991 is considered the first attempt since 1948 to reconcile some differences between these two peoples. This conference again united the United States and the Soviet Union in a common cause to stop the conflict in the Holy Land. During these 2 days, Israelis negotiated with Palestinian, Jordanian, Lebanese, and Syrian diplomats. All sides were satisfied as large loans were promised to help heal the economy, and several new countries recognized Israel, including Qatar, Oman, and Tunisia, all Arab nations. On the other hand, Palestinians were happy to hear that they were recognized as a people who had been oppressed, and that their cause needed resolution. Although the Madrid Conference did not end the conflict, it was the beginning of peace talks that concluded in 1993 in the far north of Europe. The Israeli side also had an outstanding figure matching Arafat. Born in 1922, Yitzhak Rabin was a native of Jerusalem, born to a family of settlers. From early childhood, he embraced the vision of a free state of Israel. He participated in the 1948 war, where he became known as a capable leader, pragmatic and calm. By 1967, he became Chief of Staff of the Israel Defense Forces and one of the main heroes of the victory in the Six-Day War. However, he was not satisfied with the direction Israel was going, establishing rule by brute force. That's why Rabin entered politics and even became the first native-born Israeli prime minister in 1974. It was during his second term that he paved his way into history textbooks with his peaceful intentions. Following the Madrid Conference, secret negotiations continued, mainly in Oslo. Curiously, although these agreements are named after the Norwegian capital, they were signed elsewhere, mainly in Washington and Taba, Egypt. Norway mediated the process, and although the Oslo Accords of 1993 did not actually resolve the conflict, they were the beginning of a reconciliation process, a process that was never completed. Some of the main outcomes were that Israel for the first time officially recognized the PLO, and Arafat as representing the Palestinian people. The Palestinian Authority was also created, and Palestinians gained some autonomy in specific areas, while others remained disputed. The handshake between Rabin and Yasser Arafat became a powerful symbol of hope and courage, and brought them the Nobel Peace Prize. But many did not see it that way. Many Palestinians felt betrayed by their leadership and continued terrorist actions and bombings. Others were happy because they were allowed to return to their homes. In Israel, the treaty also had mixed reception. Many felt that Rabin had given away territories conquered with Israeli blood. One group even organized and carried out the assassination of Rabin, who left the stage of life in 1995. Like Rabin's life, after the agreements, peace was short-lived. But before his death, Rabin took another step toward peace. This one was with King Hussein of Jordan. These two leaders signed an agreement formally ending the 46-year state of war between the two peoples. Unlike the agreement with the Palestinians, this treaty remained firm. But with Palestine, the most important issues were not resolved. Uncertainty continued, and soon the Second Intifada began. Unlike the first, this uprising, which erupted in September 2000, was much bloodier from both sides. Ariel Sharon, the opposition leader in Israel, decided to visit the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Sharon, a former military commander during wars, was known for his tough and often violent approach to crisis. Although the visit itself was peaceful, it was perceived as a provocation, and riots began almost immediately. Protests turned into conflict, and a mass uprising lasted 5 years. Sharon became prime minister in March of the following year and led the Israeli side. Palestinian militants began using suicide bombers and armed attacks on Israeli civilians. On the other hand, Israel began killing known Palestinian figures and occupying key areas, often forcibly. The West Bank was the main site of violence. There, Israel had a military goal: to destroy Palestinian military structures and disarm the people. Fertile ground for atrocities. They created a separation barrier in the West Bank, making Palestinians feel even worse. As the years passed, nothing changed. Expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank continued, and Palestinian factions were divided on how best to achieve their goals. Yasser Arafat failed to establish control over these groups, and he passed away in 2004. After his death, the Islamist group Hamas became the main Palestinian organization in Gaza. While Fatah controlled the West Bank, the peace process stalled and Israel returned to unilateral solutions. The Intifada ended in 2005 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, where Sharon and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas signed a treaty, pledging to restrain their forces but without any real agreements. Israel promised to leave again occupied territories and release 900 Palestinian prisoners. Nevertheless, problems and disputes remained. But during these wars, Israel survived and progressed, even becoming a major force in the region. And these people have only themselves to thank for it, because the progress of a nation that was and still is surrounded by enemies, and with limited natural resources is astonishing. Today, Israel is one of the most technologically developed nations in the world, and Jews are some of the most effective leaders in the world. And how did it happen that a nation that faced such oppression and genocide survived all that and rose above to become what it is today? Well, Israel's rapid transformation into a technological power began with bare necessity. This nation was surrounded by enemies who wanted nothing to do with it. Therefore, any trade was excluded. Thus, Israelis were on their own. The next step was to find people who were creative. Fortunately, there were and still are many Jewish people who are among the most talented people in the world. Lastly, there was a national strategy to improve the nation in these areas necessary for great functioning and progress. The first and most important task in 1948 was to become self-sufficient. And one of the most important figures in this progress toward innovation was Shimon Peres. Today mostly known as the architect of Israel's nuclear program. Being Prime Minister of Israel in the 1980s and 1990s, was one of the pioneers of vital collaboration between government, scientists, and the private sector. His actions led to the creation of the Iron Dome missile defense system, a technological marvel, but also a necessity for Israel and its development under pressure. However, military achievements and technology are not everything, and part of the invention budget had to go in the direction of other technologies that would make the Israeli name known in the world. And this is the moment where history leads us to Yossi Vardi. Yossi Vardi was a dreamer who saw potential in every situation, no matter how difficult the circumstances. Born in Israel, he began his journey believing in the power of ideas. In the mid-1990s, he became the most important person in the company that created ICQ, the world's first instant messaging platform. This opportunity changed the internet world in seconds. His success was something that inspired others. Soon his discovery was sold to AOL, and after him, Israel became the startup nation. But Vardi is not just a man chasing profit. His passion for innovation is his driving force. Moreover, Vardi proved to be a great mentor, able to spot talent among others. His journey embodied Israel's aspiration to become what it is today. Following in his footsteps, or even ahead of him, many Jews began founding startups in the 1990s and early 2000s. And many major high-tech companies created centers in Israel because it is fertile ground for ideas. Among them Intel and Microsoft. And results soon appeared in technologies such as Waze, Mobileye, and Checkpoint software. Nevertheless, it is very telling that these technologies are mainly related to security, which is connected to Israel's situation and possible terrorist attacks. But Israel today is much more than just technological progress. Many people who consider Israel their home today have descendants who arrive in the Holy Land from all over Europe and even from other continents in their families and their mindset and life. To this day, there are many habits typical of their former homelands. This cultural diversity and blending of ideas plays as significant a role in the character of the nation as technology. Each of these groups of settlers contributes to society with unique traditions, cuisine, and artistic expression. Figures like Amos Oz and David Grossman use literature to explore the complexities of Israeli identity. And in music, artists like Aiden Rakel blend traditional sounds with modern influences, showing how tradition can always be contemporary. Many famous world stars today are from Israel or have roots in Israel. Among them Gal Gadot and Natalie Portman. Some other Jewish actors have connections to Israel, like Jeff Goldblum. But this diversity also created some internal divisions, especially economic disparities. This economic inequality and growing gap between the country's prosperous high-tech sector and its peripheral agricultural communities. Additionally, there are political disagreements, especially the question of how much religion should be included in state policy. Current Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is also a polarizing figure among people, where a large part of the nation is satisfied with how he behaves in times of external crises, and his actions, while many are dissatisfied with his domestic policies and his actions that have led to deepening this economic stratification of society. Nevertheless, despite all other problems, the main concern for Israel remains the geopolitical situation, the dynamics surrounding Israel, which is much more dangerous than its internal affairs. As the years passed, the main partner and ally for Israel became the United States. The most powerful nation in the world helped Israel overcome political regional isolation. The Abraham Accords, mainly supported by the United States under President Donald Trump, truly changed these regional relations. These agreements normalized ties between Israel and several Arab countries, including the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. These nations now have flights between them and have even begun trade relations as the safest path to peace. Figures like Jared Kushner and Yossi Cohen, former head of Mossad, were leaders of these negotiations that could bring more certainty to this region in the future. Nevertheless, there are always new or old enemies. Iran and Turkey have territorial disputes with Israel. These are powerful nations, and tension with them is never easy. The main advantage Israel has is its relationship with the United States as a diplomatic defender that can provide military assistance, linked to shared research initiatives and economic agreements. But that's not all. Israel also improved its relations with India, where Israeli experts helped in the development of technology for this most populous nation. But the problem remains in the neighborhood, and it not only remains, but intensifies. And history will again take a sinister turn today. Although there are some exceptions, Israel is still surrounded by hostile nations. Even if the governments of these nations sign treaties with Israel, there is still hatred among the people. And some of these people who hate Israel even live in Israel in refugee camps in poor conditions, fearing nothing because they have nothing to lose. The most famous and one of the most difficult to resolve is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. After partial resolution, after the Second Intifada, deep distrust between the two peoples remained, fueled by occasional massacres committed by either of these sides. The construction of the separation barrier in the West Bank, like the Berlin Wall of the East, physically represents this barrier and division between the two communities. And from that moment, everything went from bad to worse. The main issues of the conflict are the status of Jerusalem, the expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and the blockade of the Gaza Strip. These three disagreements seem inevitable today. There is also the blockade of Gaza, imposed by Israel in 2007, as that is the year Hamas took control of this territory. This blockade further intensified tensions. The Hamas side claims this blockade is causing a humanitarian catastrophe, while the Israeli side has a different explanation to avoid militant attacks. From this aggressive group, Hamas leaders such as Ismail Haniyeh and Yahya Sinwar have led the organization both in governance and armed confrontation, leading to recurring cycles of violence. Israel's military operations, such as the 2014 Gaza War, highlight its strategy of preemptive strikes and robust defense, embodied in the Iron Dome missile defense system. And the latest terrorist attack on Israeli civilians at a music festival began a new war. That is still ongoing, and this time more bloody than ever. Historians have yet to give their opinion on this moment in time, but it is far from the only problem in the immediate vicinity. In recent decades, Israel's main rival in the region has become the Islamic Republic of Iran, and tensions are only growing. Iran is very different from other Arab nations, and Israel's alliance with the U.S. further fuels hatred. Iran's ideological opposition to Israel's existence and its support for groups like Hezbollah and Hamas have created even more hostility. Iran's nuclear program is an existential threat to Israel, and the #1 subject of every Israeli security problem. Covert operations, including cyber attacks and targeted strikes on Iranian facilities, show Israel's approach to preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear capabilities. New missiles from both sides launched in recent months have brought these two nations to the very brink of war. On the other hand, Hezbollah, as an Iranian ally, operates from southern Lebanon and represents a significant security challenge. Its leader, Hassan Nasrallah, transformed the organization into a dangerous military force supported by Iranian funding and armament. The 2006 Lebanon War showed how dangerous this enemy is. Preemptive airstrikes against it did not neutralize the organization. Unlike these, tension with Turkey is not so dangerous, and they are more of a diplomatic nature and change from time to time. The same applies to relations with the Gulf states. The main reason why Israel still exists is Mossad and its operations. As one of the most capable secret intelligence agencies in the world, from kidnapping notorious Nazis to killing main enemies, this organization does everything to protect Israel, whatever the cost. In 2018, Mossad managed to extract Iranian nuclear documents and weaken their nuclear program. Today, looking back at the history of Israel and its people, their very existence is an act of heroism and a testament to resilience and renewal. A history that begins in the biblical era as the beginning of monotheism. Notable people such as King David and Solomon still remain very important in world history, and the destruction of this state still captivates artists. Many nations ruled the Holy Land from Romans to Christians and Muslims up to the modern era, and Israel, all have carved their presence into the spirit of this land. But the moment that changed everything happened with the modern revival of Israel in 1948. After centuries of diaspora, persecution, and struggle against all odds, this state survived the horrors of the Holocaust and successfully defended its statehood. In the early days, over time, the defender became the attacker, who significantly increased his nation and grew into a technological power and a beacon of innovation, balancing between ancient traditions and modern achievements. Nevertheless, there are many challenges on the way, especially the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which needs to be resolved. In these relations lies the key to peace in the Middle East, but this area has never been peaceful. Today, Israel is not only a regional power, but also an important player on the world stage. With advanced technologies and strong alliances, it remains one of the most important nations in the world in every respect.